it matters who I am. In Exodus chapter 3 and verses 1 through 15, Moses is tending to the flocks of his father-in-law. And verse 2 says, "And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush." And so Moses looks at this bush and he sees it burning, but it's not being consumed. And Moses said, "I will turn aside and see this great sight while the bush does not burn." And so the Lord saw that he turned to look, and God called to him from the midst of the bush, and he said, "Moses, Moses, where you stand is holy ground." And Moses responds by saying, "Here I am. Here I am." God says to Moses, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham and Isaac and of Jacob, your God." Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. And the Lord said to Moses, "I've surely seen the oppression of my people, and I've heard their cry, because they're taskmasters, and I know their sorrows. So I've come down to deliver them out of this oppression, to deliver them from the Egyptians, and to bring them up from the land to a good land, a large land, a land that flows with milk and honey." In verse 8, it says he came down to deliver the people. And then in verse 9, "Behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me, and I've also seen the oppression in which the Egyptians oppressed them." And in verse 10, he says to Moses, "Come now, I'll send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of oppression." Verse 10, we know very well that God comes down to His people. And He calls to Moses and says, "Come now, I'm going to send you." Remember a moment ago he said, "Here I am." And God says to him, "I'm going to send you." Verse 11, Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, that I should bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?" So he said, "I'll certainly be with you, Moses, and I'll give you a sign." Moses said to God in verse 13, "Indeed, when I come to the children of Israel and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they're going to say to me, 'Who is it? What is his name of the one that has sent you?'" And I love verse 14, Exodus chapter 3 and verse 14. God said to Moses, "I am who I am. And you go and tell the children of Israel, you go and tell the Egyptians." The essence is you go and tell all people that I am has sent you. Who I am matters. There's a lot we could say about this statement to where God says, "I am who I am." One thing for sure, God is saying, who I am is important, Moses. We could say God is saying it matters who I am. That was a long, long time ago. But it still matters who God is. It still matters that God is I am. Does God ever say it matters who you are? I think in chapter 3 of Exodus, in verses 7 through 10, that is exactly what God is saying to Moses. "Moses, it matters who you are. You're the one I've chosen. You're the one that I want to lead my people out of oppression, out of heartache, to give them relief. And it matters who you are, because you're the one that I've chosen." Of course, we know that Moses made all of his excuses, but we know that Moses went. Moses come to realize that who he was, it really did matter. Let's go to the New Testament, to the book of 2 Timothy. In chapter 4, in verses 9 through 11, the Apostle Paul is, we believe, near his time of death at this time, and he writes a letter to this young preacher, Timothy, and here's what he says. Timothy, be diligent to come to me quickly, for Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world, and he's departed for Thessalonica. Paul says, Timothy, only Luke is with me. And he says, get Mark and bring him with you, for he's useful to me for ministry. Now, we know this young man, Mark. We believe him to be a young man by the name of John Mark. John Mark and Barnabas were cousins, and they were companions on a missionary trip with the Apostle Paul. And for some reason, John Mark decided to go home. Paul wasn't happy with this at all. In fact, it caused a lot of problems between Barnabas and Paul. And when it came time for another missionary trip, Barnabas wanted to take John Mark along with him again. But Paul said, no, you're not going to take John Mark. We know that Barnabas and Paul had a great falling out over this. In Acts chapter 15, in verse 39 and 40, it says, then the contention became so sharp that they departed from one another. And so Barnabas took Mark and he sailed to Cyprus, but Paul took Silas and departed. And now, years later, we see that the Apostle Paul writes to Timothy, and he says, Timothy, I need John Mark. Why? What made the difference? Here are several different translations that describes Paul's want and need for John Mark. The New King James Version said, he's useful to me. Another translation says, he's profitable to me. One translation says, he's helpful to me. A very modern translation says, he can help me in my work. If you or I were writing this, we might say, bring John Mark to me because he matters. He's important to me. It really did matter who John Mark was. It really did. I know that you're a part of a youth group. You're important to your youth group. You're important to the church you attend. And probably, I feel pretty sure that sometimes in your life, maybe your youth minister, your minister, or someone else has given you a task to do that you probably felt like you can't do that. That task is too much for you. It's out of your comfort zone. Like Moses said to God, I can't do that. Why did God choose Moses? Because Moses mattered to God. Who he was mattered. He was the one that God chose to do that task. And oh, what an awesome task it was. But maybe you've been given a task and you don't feel worthy to do it or up to do it. You don't feel that you can do it. But listen, it matters so much who you are. You might be the only one that can do that task. You come to CYC. There are great people at CYC. Some of our heroes are at CYC. We could listen to them all night long as they preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, and they expound the Word of God to us in such a wonderful way, and the message just strikes our hearts. Now listen, and listen very carefully. You matter to CYC. Who you are matters to Challenge Youth Conference. More important than CYC, who you are matters to your church family. It matters to your youth group. But absolutely, who you are matters to God. More than anything else, who you are matters. It matters who you are.